You can ask your next question of this witness. Mr. Giller, I think you're muted.
I apologize, Your Honor, and everyone. Can you hear me now, Professor Hood?
Yes.
Great. Professor Hood, in your report, you state that poll worker training is important to ensure uniform implementation of the law. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you would agree that implementation should be done in a standardized way across the state?
Preferably, yes.
But you haven't conducted any analysis to determine whether poll worker training is done in any standardized way across North Carolina. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so you don't know whether SB 824 would be implemented in a uniform manner.
I don't know that ahead of time. I'm assuming that it will be.
But you haven't done any analysis to support that hope.
No, I've not.
Professor Hood, in section 3 of your report, you state that the process under SB 824 is substantively similar to that of the South Carolina voter ID statute. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I just had a few questions about that. Isn't it the case that prior to the passage of the South Carolina's voter ID law, voters had to bring proof of identity in order to vote?
Yes, that's correct. Not necessarily government issued photo ID, but yes, some proof of identification. That's correct.
In South Carolina?
Yes, in South Carolina.
And that had been the process for decades prior to the passage of a voter ID law.
From memory, I think it goes back into the 70s. I couldn't tell you the exact year, but yes, I would say decades would be fair.
And isn't it the case that except for that March 2016 election we discussed with HB 589, that North Carolina voters had never prior been expected to bring some form of identification to the polls?
That's my understanding, yes.
And you don't mention that difference between North Carolina and South Carolina in your report, do you?
No, not explicitly.
So it's not mentioned.
Well, I think indirectly it's mentioned in the research article because I think it discusses a little bit of the background on South Carolina's identification laws.
But you don't address North Carolina's identification laws.
No. I mean, besides talking about SB 824, no.
So just to sort of clarify, there is no reference in your report to the differences between the history of North Carolina, where they were not required to bring ID, and South Carolina, where they were.
Correct.
Next, you compare IDs that are acceptable in North Carolina with those IDs that are acceptable in South Carolina. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I think you point out that both North and South Carolina have free IDs. Is that right?
That's correct.
Just to confirm, South Carolina free IDs that are issued by the County Board of Elections, they never expire. Is that correct?
From my memory, that's correct.
Okay.
If I'm wrong, I'm glad to be corrected.
Okay, but not a memory test. But as of now, it's your understanding is that South Carolina free IDs issued by the County Board of Elections don't expire.
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. But free IDs issued by the North Carolina Board of Elections, those do expire, correct?
Yes, I think after 10 years.
And you don't reference that difference in your report, is that correct?
I don't think that's mentioned. I don't think that difference is explicitly mentioned. I don't know if I'd have to look. I'm looking right now to see if I talk about the free ID program in North Carolina or how it would be implemented. So no, it doesn't look like I mentioned that.
Thank you. Professor Hood, your analysis of the South Carolina voter ID law is contained in the study that you conducted titled Palmetto Postmortem. Is that correct?
Yes,
And this is what's attached to your expert report.
that's correct.
You've discussed it during your direct examination.
Correct.
I just want to have a couple of questions about that analysis in that report. The study you conducted regarding South Carolina's voter ID law, that studied the effect of the voter ID on turnout. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the analysis that you reference in your report, that excluded inactive voters. Is that correct?
The analysis I referenced, yes, excluded inactive registrants. There are more tables in an appendix that include inactive registrants.
Well, we'll get to those in a second, but just
Okay.
the main report that you discussed with your counsel, that excluded inactive voters.
That is true, yes.
Okay. And just so we're clear for the record, an inactive voter is a voter who has shown no voting activity or contact over a specified period of time.
Right. Right.
But there's nothing that precludes an inactive voter in South Carolina from voting in a given election. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So sort of to be clear, if an inactive voter went to the polls to vote, they would still have to meet the requirements of the South Carolina voter ID law in order to vote.
Correct.
And since the main of your study excluded inactive voters, that means it did not measure any effect on turnout among inactive voters.
Well, the tables I discussed yesterday did not, no.
Professor Hood, your Palmetto postmortem study only relied on election turnout data from 2010 and 2014. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And those are both midterm elections, correct?
That is correct.
And so you didn't examine any effect on turnout during presidential elections.
Correct. Again, as I mentioned yesterday, those were the two most proximate elections to the implementation of South Carolina's voter ID law.
Correct, but you could have looked at presidential elections before and after the voter ID law.
Well, yes and no. I would, it's not easy to acquire these voter registration files sometimes. And we only had one snapshot of who didn't have an ID. And again, the further you move away from that snapshot in time, the less reliable it's going to be. So in one way, the answer to your question is yes, but that doesn't mean that that's the best way to carry out the study, if you will.
Understood, but you didn't, just sort of clarify, you didn't try to acquire that data to determine whether it would help or hurt the study.
Well, as in terms of the no match list, if you will, there's only one snapshot of that that we did acquire. So there's nothing else to look at related to that. I did not collect voter registration data from, say, 2012 or 2016, for instance.
Or 2008.
That's true.
And just to, but you would agree that, like, as a matter of course, the demographics of voters who vote during a presidential election are different than those that vote during a midterm.
Turnout typically is higher in a presidential election than a midterm.
And there are some voters who only vote in presidential elections, right?
That is true, yes.
And would you agree there's some correlation between higher socioeconomic status and higher rates of voting?
There typically has been, yes.
And vice versa, lower propensity voters often have lower socioeconomic status?
That is true, yes.
And so those types of infrequent voters that I think we talked about who might only vote during a presidential election would not have been captured by your analysis of South Carolina.
Right. This only looks at those two midterm elections.
And I think you discussed this yesterday, but your primary analysis in the Palmetto study relies on a difference in difference test to study the effects of the South Carolina voter ID law on turnout. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And just so I understand, and so the record, I guess, is clear, the difference in difference design, this is from your report, assumes that any estimated effect on turnout is attributed to the South Carolina voter ID law, as opposed to any other differences between registrants who do and do not possess the requisite ID. Is that correct?
That's fair, yes.
And this difference in difference methodology you discuss in your report, that incorporates something called the parallel trend assumption. Is that right?
Right.
And my understanding of the parallel trend assumption is that it assumes that the turnout rate over time, other than the change in the voter ID law, would stay the same for registrants with and without ID. Is that a fair description?
Right. Right. But for the implementation of the law, turnout rates for these groups would continue on the same path.
Right. So the only thing that you are changing for the individuals is the ID. That's the only sort of factor you're taking into account.
That's what you're trying to boil it down to, yes.
Okay. So that means you're not taking other factors into account that are not the voter ID.
True.
Okay. And I think you list some of those other potential factors, and I just want to go through them in your report. Are one of those potential other factors that could impact that age?
Yeah, age, is that what you said?
Yes.
Yes.
And is another factor income?
Yes.
And these are factors that could affect turnout.
Correct. We know there's a correlation between those factors and turnout. Yes.
And race and ethnicity, is that another factor?
You know, historically it has been, more recently, especially in the South, not so much actually.
Did you reference race and ethnicity as a factor in your report?
Yes, and to some extent I'm controlling for that because I show the difference in difference tests by racial category. I was just answering your question in terms of overall race and its association or correlation with turnout.
So
In
historically,
a general sense. Yeah,
right.
Historically, yes.
Okay. And education is another factor that can affect turnout.
Yes.
And just sort of to confirm, those factors that we just discussed, age, income, education, those weren't taken into account by your study at all.
Right.
And you also didn't conduct any analysis of elections prior to 2010 in South Carolina. Is that correct?
That's correct. Again, that's just to be straightforward about it. I don't know why I would have done it in this context.
It wouldn't be, Professor Hood, wouldn't it be important to determine whether there were any trends going into 2010 that you would need to control for?
Well, not using this specific design. I mean, you could perform that analysis, true. Again, one of the highlights, I guess, or better points of this difference in difference analysis is that you have a snapshot in time of the electorate prior to implementation of the law. So you sort of have an idea of their turnout rate before them and then afterwards. Again, using this particular design, I don't have to go back to 2008, 2006 necessarily, and I didn't do that. That's true.
Wouldn't it be the case that, like, depending on the nature of, for example, like 2008 election, and perhaps, like, for example, historic turnout, due to Barack Obama's race, that might have some effect on what might happen in 2010.
Well, that's certainly possible.
And you didn't do any analysis to that effect.
Again, I didn't analyze any elections in South Carolina prior to 2010. No.
Okay. And your analysis in the Palmetto study also does not account for other factors that could affect turnout, such as the identities of the candidates running for office. Is that correct?
Correct. I mean, except I guess you could say in a general sense, this research design does that. I didn't do that specifically. That's correct. But in a general sense, we have a snapshot of turnout prior to the implementation of the law. So everyone's exposed, if you will, in South Carolina to the same campaign stimuli based on who's running, candidates, campaigns, advertising, and that kind of thing. And then the same thing in 2014. But no, I didn't look at specific candidates themselves. But, again, I don't know if I said this yesterday, but again, the 2014 midterm in South Carolina was just less competitive. It just was. And there was a fall off in turnout. But again, the nice thing about this design is that it can take that into account and look at the turnout prior to that in 2010 for both of these groups, and then again calculate these gaps if they exist between the two election cycles.
To the extent that gap might have been, rephrase, to the extent that decrease might have been candidate driven and thus, might not have gone into the future, your study would not take that into account.
Well, again, I didn't look at specific candidates or campaigns. That's fair. The sort of campaign atmosphere, if you will, for the 2010 and 2014 election cycles are sort of captured by the research design, if that makes sense in general.
Right. I just, so we're clear, if there was a lackluster candidate or campaign in 2014 that would have driven down turnout, you wouldn't have taken into account. That would perhaps be something that would not be a repeating event. That would not be taken into account by your study. Well,
again, I think to be fair, the answer is I didn't take a particular candidate or campaign into account. No.
Okay. And just you also didn't take into account or look into the way that parties or organizations try to mobilize voters that varies from election to election.
That's correct.
Okay. And you didn't consider whether or not either of these elections had any specific hot button issues that voters may or may not have been more excited about.
That's correct.
And your study didn't explicitly or take into account that there were more registered voters in 2014 and 2010, did it?
Well, it can certainly control for that, and it does. And again, one of the things maybe we didn't talk about yesterday is that we're looking at a panel actually of voters, which isn't necessary to implement this research design, but the same voters that were present in 2010 are present in 2014 in this particular study. So it's the exact same group of people, if you will, overall.
Right. But there could also be more or less individuals based on the number of registered voters, right?
Well, in the electorate as a whole, but not in the study.
Okay.
So, I mean, again, the exact same people in 2010 are also present in 2014 in the study.
Right. But the effect that turnout, and sort of just to sort of circle back, that doesn't take into account any of the differences in potential turnout due to age or education. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Professor Hood, in your report, you state, when discussing the Palmetto study, you state that in terms of race, whites were found to be slightly more affected than Black registrants. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that is based on just active voters. Is that correct?
Right. So that, yes, that would be based on the analysis in Table 4
We can,
and Table 5.
right.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think you stated on direct this was your primary analysis of the study. Is that correct?
Yeah, those two tables, yes.
Okay. I'd like to turn to Table B of that study. I think this is JX39 at PDF page 50. And this is Table B from your report. Is that correct, Professor Hood?
Yes, it is.
And I think it says at the top, difference in difference panel estimates of the South Carolina voter ID statute, active and inactive registrants. Is that correct?
Correct.
And so just to confirm, but I think the title says it, this table includes both active and inactive registrants.
Right.
And the earlier analysis we discussed only had active registrants. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So where it says the inter-election difference, which I think is like the fifth column, this is the difference between, this is how active voters were affected following the implementation of South Carolina voter ID law. Is that right?
Active and inactive in this table.
Right, active and inactive difference in South Carolina voter ID statute.
Yes.
Okay. And so I'm reading it right, when inactive voters are included, the inter-election difference for white registrants is negative 2.5. Is that correct?
Yes.
And when inter-election difference for black registrants is included and inactive voters, it goes to negative 2.7. That's the last column. Is that right?
Yes.
So is it fair to say, and as I think Table B suggests, that when inactive voters are included, black voters are slightly more affected than white voters in your South Carolina study?
In this particular iteration, yes.
Okay.
Again, there's two other iterations added on top of this, though.
Well, but this,
Tables C and D as well. So, but
Professor Hood, if you know, your counsel is more than free to discuss those with you. I just want to make sure I understand what your report says at the moment. And this
you're
Table
correct.
B, sorry, if you could please finish.
You're correct, sir.
So I'm correct. This table and this analysis shows a slight increase in when taking inactive registrants into account, that black voters are slightly more affected.
Right, 0.2. Yes.
But more affected.
Yes. Yes.
You can take this down now. Professor Hood, I also want to discuss your counterfactual that you had in your Palmetto study. So we can bring up the same report, but turning to page 42. I think it's table 7, page 9. Professor Hood, in this table 7, this represents a counterfactual that incorporates both turnout rates and rates of ID possession. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the last row of this table, labeled difference, right at the bottom, measures the effect of the South Carolina law taking into account turnout and ID possession rates.
Yes.
Okay. And staying on that last row, but turning to the second column now, it's accurate to say that South Carolina's voter ID law decreased turnout among white registrants by 0.19%. Is that accurate?
Yes. Now, let me just back up real quick and say that, you know, this is a counterfactual and we're making certain estimates or assertions here that may or may not, you know, have ever come to light, so to speak, or have been played out. We're making certain assumptions here. And the major assumption being made here is that the turnout rate for those without identification in 2014 would have remained what it was in 2010. So that's, I just want to put that out there. That's somewhat of a heroic assumption, if you will. That's what this is based on.
Well, we'll get to that in 1 second.
Okay.
Thank you for clarification. But just, I want to just make sure we go through what the chart actually says, and then we can discuss that for a second. So this does say, though, that there's turnout among white registrants decreased by 0.19% in this counterfactual.
That's the estimate. Yes, that's correct.
And turning to the next one, it shows that the decrease among black registrants is 0.25%.
Correct.
And that is greater than 0.19% for white registrants.
Yes.
And sort of circling back a little bit to one of our previous discussions, when you were in your original analysis, you did not account for other potential factors like income, age, and education. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Let me take this down. I also want to discuss now some of the actual analysis you did for the South Carolina voting that you did of the South Carolina voting ID law in the Palmetto postmortem. As part of your South Carolina study, you compared the voter history files for the elections before and after the implementation of the South Carolina voter ID bill. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you compared the official turnout in elections before and after the implementation of the South Carolina voter ID law.
Yes.
And I think you mentioned this, you relied on a no-match list produced by the South Carolina Elections Commission.
Yes.
I think you said you reviewed reasonable impediment declarations in South Carolina. Is that right?
Yes.
And provisional ballots in South Carolina.
Yes.
And the reason you did that is because you would never assume anything in social science research until you were able to test it. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair. Yes.
And sort of to confirm, you didn't do that type of analysis in North Carolina. Is that correct?
It's, under SB 824, not a possibility to do what I did in South Carolina.
Well, we'll go through that in a little bit more detail, but I mean, we discussed that HB 589 had been in effect. There was an election in North Carolina where voter IDs was required, correct?
Yes.
And you did not try to analyze that election or the results in any way.
I did not, and I wasn't asked to do that.
Okay. Now, I want to be a little more specific about some of the things that could have been done. You didn't conduct an analysis of voter history files for elections before and after the implementation of HB 589 in North Carolina. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you didn't conduct an analysis of official turnout records for elections before and after the implementation of HB 589 in North Carolina. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you didn't request a no-match list that South Carolina might have using their state of board data.
South Carolina or North Carolina?
North Carolina. Let me rephrase the question. You didn't request to create a no-match list using North Carolina data, did you?
No, I did not.
And you didn't analyze the number of provisional ballots utilized in any North Carolina election, including the one where HB 589 was in effect.
That is correct.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you reviewed reasonable impediment affidavits submitted in South Carolina's elections. Is that right?
Yes.
And I believe there were 131 reasonable impediment declarations executed in South Carolina's 2014 general election. Is that right?
Yes, I have data, just to be specific, for 45 of 46 counties. But that number would be correct for 45 counties.
131 reasonable.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And that was 40, how many counties was that?
45 out of 46.
And you say in your report that you believe the South Carolina's law reasonable impediment provision and SB 824's reasonable impediment provisions are very similar. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I assume HB 589's reasonable impediment provision was also very similar.
It was similar, yes.
Okay.
Not exactly the same thing, but similar.
Okay. Do you recall in your June 2019 deposition becoming aware that 1,048 reasonable ballot declarations had been executed in the March 2016 primary election, during which...
Mr. Giller, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but your internet blipped and I did not hear your figure.
Oh,
so
no problem. I'll ask the question. Professor Hood, do you recall in your June 2019 deposition becoming aware that 1,048 reasonable impediment ballot declarations were executed in the March 2016 primary election, during which HB 589 was implemented?
I was told that, yes.
Okay. Do you have any reason to believe that is untrue?
No, I didn't say that. I just said I was made aware of that fact. I had not investigated it prior to that, is what I'm saying.
Thank you. And that was before you finalized your December 2020 report. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And just, 1,048 is more than the 1,048 in North Carolina is more than the 131 in South Carolina. Is that correct?
That's a correct statement, yes.
Thank you. But you never made any reference into your report about the fact that there were so many more reasonable impediment affidavits submitted in North Carolina than South Carolina in your report. Is that correct?
Well, again, I wasn't asked, and I didn't do any research on anything involving HB 589. So the answer to your question is yes, I did not include that.
You didn't include the actual number of, or any analysis of how many reasonable impediment declarations were actually filed or used in North Carolina.
Not under HB 589, no.
Well, I mean, that's, as you pointed out, that's the only thing you could have done.
Right. And I'm just saying I wasn't asked to opine on HB 589, so I didn't include that.
Thank you. I want to turn to another quick issue for a second. You conducted a study in 2012 called "They Just Do Not Vote Like They Used to," a methodology to empirically assess election fraud. Do you remember that?
Objection, Your Honor. I, of course, don't know exactly where Mr. Giller is going, but this article itself is on a topic about which Professor Hood has not been offered as an expert and is beyond the scope of his expert testimony to the extent that it deals with the issue of voter fraud. That is not something that we have offered him as an expert on, and not something that he has opined upon in his reports.
I would just say, Your Honor, that it's listed in his bibliography. It's a report he authored. And in addition, I believe he was tenured as an expert in political science.
You may answer the question.
I
Yeah,
can repeat.
I did write that article, yes.
In that article, you and your co-author present a general methodology to study contemporary election fraud and applied that approach to a particular type of alleged election fraud. Is that a fair description of the article?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. And the article concludes that and it was an article examining Georgia elections, correct?
Right. We were, yes, more specifically looking to see if anyone dead was voting in Georgia.
Right. Thank you. And the conclusion, as I understand it, is after examining approximately 2.1 million votes cast during 2006 general election in Georgia, the study concluded that there was no evidence that election fraud was committed by any deceased registrants. Is that fair?
I think that's fair, yes.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, if you're dead, you can't vote, but on behalf of a deceased registrant, I guess is the way to put it.
But so just to, exactly, but to be sort of clear, your report found no instances after examining 2.1 million votes that there was election fraud.
Right. I think we were left with a very small number of votes that were just indeterminate. Now, I'm not alleging those were fraudulent one way or the other. I'm just saying that we were left with a handful of votes that we couldn't make a determination on.
Right. And I believe you've opined in other cases. And I believe you've opined in other cases about, the frequency of in-person voter impersonation as a type of voter fraud. Is that right?
I'm sure it's come up, probably.
And I think you would agree that the available data shows that in-person voting impersonation is a pretty rare phenomenon.
Right. Especially in a state like Georgia, where you have to show your government-issued photo ID to vote in person.
But putting aside that, I mean, there's nothing, this analysis of Georgia didn't include voter ID, did it?
The study about they just don't vote like they used to,
Yeah.
that one? No. It didn't. It was looking at, again, it was just looking at voting on behalf of the deceased, if you will. That's what it was looking at.
Right. And you would agree that just putting aside voter ID, right, just so we're clear about the question, that in-person voting impersonation is a rare phenomenon in general.
From what we know, yes.
Professor Hood, you testified yesterday regarding Professor James Leludis's expert report. Is that correct?
Just with that one component of his report, but yes.
Right. And as I understand it, you criticized his reference to a 2017 study in the Journal of Politics. Is that right?
Correct.
That also several times.
You were not.
On the other
Sorry, I nobody said that. You were not, though, criticizing Professor Leludis's opinion about the history of election and voting laws in North Carolina, including how facially neutral laws can, in fact, discriminate against African-American voters. Is that correct?
Yes, I wasn't asked to respond to that, and I didn't.
Okay. And so you're not criticizing his opinion that North Carolina has a higher percentage of African Americans that live in poverty than white individuals.
No, and again, I wasn't asked to respond to that.
Right. And so you're also not opining or criticizing his finding or his opinion that economic insecurity is a drag on voter participation due to greater difficulties with transportation, higher likelihood of being sick, disabled, or an inability to take time off of work to register and go to the polls. Is that right?
Right. I didn't respond to that part of his report.
And to confirm, you didn't review any data on poverty rates in North Carolina. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you didn't review any census data from North Carolina?
Not in relation to this case, no.
Okay. And you didn't review any data on car ownership rates among African Americans in North Carolina, did you?
No.
Or any data on the locations of Department of Motor Vehicle offices or county boards of election offices in North Carolina?
I did not.
All right. Now I want to show you Professor Leludis's report again, JX 695. And the reference that you were criticizing was on page 77, footnote 223. Is that right?
Well, that sounds right. I don't have it memorized, to be honest with you.
Can you, but you can see it in front of you. That's
Yeah. Yeah. It looks like footnote 223.
Okay. I'd like to direct you to the bibliography, which starts at page 79. Can we bring that up? Is this the bibliography for his report?
Okay.
All right, and it goes until page 93, I believe. Is that correct?
I'm going to take your word for that.
Okay, we can just jump. We can scroll through and see. And I won't make you count, but if I represent to you that there are 249 sources cited by Professor Lelotis in these 14 pages of bibliography, does that sound right?
Well, if you're representing that number to me, that you've counted them, I'm going to take your word, take you at your word.
Thank you. And I just want to sort of confirm, did you review all of these 249 sources in his report?
No, I wasn't asked to.
How many of them did you review?
Well, again, I was asked to respond to that particular claim made on page 77. That's what I responded to.
So just sort of to clarify, you only reviewed that one paper in his report.
The claim made from that journal article, yes.
Okay. Professor Hood, you referenced yesterday your report, Much Ado About Nothing, an empirical assessment of the Georgia voter identification statute. You can bring this down. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Before we get to discussing the Georgia report in more detail, I just want to confirm that report does not contain any analysis comparing Georgia to North Carolina, does it?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, turning to that Georgia paper, yesterday you testified that it was consistent with your South Carolina paper because it led to a small depressive effect overall on turnout after implementation, but that racial or ethnic groups were not more affected than white registrants. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And just to confirm, the Georgia study also looked to the effect of the Georgia's voter ID statute on voter turnout. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And this study also relies on the difference in difference model that we were discussing earlier.
Yes.
And that means the same parallel trends issues would also be applicable.
You're making that assumption, yes.
Well, you're making that assumption as the author of the report.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And in that study, you analyzed turnout effects by comparing 2004 turnout to 2008 turnout.
Yes.
But you also didn't conduct any analysis of elections earlier than 2004 in Georgia to understand whether there were any trends that would affect the analysis.
From my memory, that's correct, yes.
And in order to determine the number of voters who lacked photo ID in Georgia, you relied on a no match list. Is that correct?
Yes.
The study doesn't analyze whether Black voters are overrepresented on the no match list in Georgia. Is that fair?
Well, it doesn't specifically analyze that question. It, again, it takes the entire no match list into account, though.
The study does, but you didn't do a specific analysis to that effect on the no match list.
Not in that article. In a previous article, we did.
Okay. And you've observed in general, though, that there are ID possession rates. Sorry. You've observed previously, though, that there's a gap in ID possession rates between Black and white registrants in Georgia.
Yes, that's true.
Isn't it true that in 2004, Georgia required voters to present some form of ID to vote in person?
Yes, it was not necessarily government issued photo ID, but yes.
But prior to the implementation of a specific voter ID statute, they did have to bring some form of ID to the polls.
Yes, that's fair. Could be something like a utility bill, for instance. Could be a driver's license. It could have been a lot of things.
Right. But again, just to confirm, before SB 24, and with the exception of the March 2016 election under HB 589, North Carolina never had any sort of ID requirement to vote.
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. In that same report, you also identify that provisional ballots are only a measure of those registrants who may have shown up to the polls lacking proper photo ID. Is that right?
I think that's pretty close to what we state, yes.
Okay.
Maybe
and that there was-
maybe an exact quote. I can't.
it is. I can bring it up if you would like.
No, it sounds very familiar.
Thank you. And that those lacking photo ID who may have been deterred from attempting to cast an in-person ballot are not being captured by that measure. Is that right?
They're not being captured by provisional balloting. That's what we're saying there, just to be clear.
Right. So if someone is turned away or not offered a provisional ballot, they're not being captured by that measure.
Right, or if they never show up
Right.
at all.
Right, but if you're being deterred from right. So, but if the point is that if you are somehow being deterred, or correct, let me rephrase. Right. So if you don't show up, so you've been deterred from even coming, you wouldn't show up on that.
That's my thought when I was writing that sentence. Yes.
And those concerns would also apply to North Carolina, correct?
That someone that was completely deterred from voting would not show up in any kind of statistic because they had not cast a provisional ballot. Yes.
Professor Hood, you testified on direct that the lessons from implementation of the South Carolina voter ID law can be applied to North Carolina and inform what might happen if SB 824 were implemented in North Carolina. Is that fair?
That's fair, yes.
Okay. Just to confirm, the Palmetto study was a single state study. Is that right?
It was.
The single state was South Carolina.
Correct.
I'd like to show you JX39, page 34. This is your Palmetto report. It's the first page. I think if we can go, I think it's like the second paragraph, it starts that isolating, you say to that point on the top of the paragraph, isolating our study to a single state holds any nuances between these laws constant. It's like the third line down if we want to highlight it on the right-hand side. To that point, isolating our study to a single state holds any nuances between these laws constant. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And then you note a line or so down that as such, studies that rely on different methodologies, such as cross-state comparisons, but lack the types of data that we are able to bear on this question may be insufficient for the present task. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Now I'd like to sort of, this is your intro, jump to the end of your report, which I believe is page 43 of PDF, posting at 10. And I think actually, if we go up a little bit, Ashley, it's the sort of second paragraph in the right-hand column, to what degree? And so you say here, to what degree are our findings generalizable to states outside of South Carolina? We would argue for the necessity of rigorous within-state testing in other contexts to determine if similar conclusions can be drawn. As mentioned earlier, although one can categorize voter ID statutes, e.g. states that require government-issued photo ID, there remain important differences between these laws across states. Is that accurate from your report?
Yes.
Okay, you can bring this down. Just to sort of confirm based on our previous conversation, you didn't conduct any rigorous testing of the application of SB 824, HB 589 in North Carolina. Is that correct?
Well, again, as we've talked about, it's impossible to do what I did in South Carolina on SB 824.
Right, but not with HB 589.
Again, I wasn't asked to analyze HB 589, and I did not do so. That's true.
Let me go ahead and interject right here, if that's okay. It's now 12:50. As mentioned earlier, today's court schedule was scheduled to go until 1 o'clock, but I wanted to just go ahead and pause the testimony of Professor Hood right now. Sir, are you able to come back Monday morning at 9:30?
Yes, I am, Your Honor.
Okay, great.
I
And,
I do have a meeting at 11 that day.
okay,
11:30, I believe. So
okay.
I think that the cross will not last suitably long enough to make him miss his 11 o'clock.
Okay. How much longer do you think that you have with him, Mr. Giller?
Probably like 15 minutes or so.
Okay, fair enough. Well then, Professor Hood, we'll see you back here Monday morning at 9:30. Okay?
yes, Your Honor. Thank you.
Thank you. Just wanted to allow you all a few minutes if you had anything to add, anything to put on the record before we recess for the day.
Your Honor, for the legislative defendants, we will have some evidence that we would like to move into the record, but with the court's permission, we would do that on Monday at 4:30.
That's fine. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Anything for the plaintiffs or the state defendants?
Nothing for the plaintiffs, Your Honor.
Nothing from the state defendants, Your Honor.
Okay. Well, let me just ask Mr. Thompson, and I think I've received the witness list generally, but it's hard to know whether some of those witnesses will be fairly short or fairly long or and that sort of thing. You've had, I think this is your second witness. Professor Hood is your second witness. And understanding, I won't hold you to it because you don't know how long the cross-examinations will take, but where generally would you say that you are ballpark in your evidence?
Your Honor, I think we're probably about halfway through or so. We have Dr. Janet Thornton, who will testify, and my best guess is that that might consume Monday. And then we have Mr. Neesby and Kim Strock. So I think that will take probably most of Tuesday, maybe a little bit into Wednesday. Again, I'm guessing on the length of crosses, but that's my best guess.
Okay, so it looks like you should finish your case either Tuesday or Wednesday, and then the plaintiffs would have a chance to put on rebuttal evidence after that point.
Yes, Your Honor.
And Ms. Riggs, do you know yet whether you'll be putting on any rebuttal evidence?
Without holding me to it, I would venture to guess we would have 1 to 2 short witnesses.
Okay, fair enough. And I certainly won't hold you to it. Well, thank you for that information. Let me just send out sort of a gut check. How are you holding up otherwise? You okay? Things still going okay for you mentally?
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you very much. We seem to be doing just fine, but thank you for the kind inquiry.
Thank you, Your Honor, for the inquiry and for allowing us to finish this important trial next week. We're grateful for your time.
Sure. Everybody, or anybody got Zoom fatigue or anything like that going on? Mr. Steed, you okay? I hadn't heard from you much today.
I've only been in here for 4 hours, but I'm hanging in there.
Well, great. Well, thank you all for allowing us to do this virtually. I've told several people that as far as trials that would be good ones, perhaps to the extent there are any, to do virtually, this is probably a good one. We don't have a jury. We don't have those 12 or 14 people to think about. The lawyers are from all over. The witnesses are from all over. The judges are from all over. And frankly, from my perspective, I know we had a little hiccup on Monday, but it's gone fairly smooth. And so I've been pretty pleased with it. And I hope that you all feel like are able to do as much as you would be able to do if we were live and in person.
Absolutely, Your Honor.
So if you ever have any issues about that, if you ever feel like anyway you're not able to conduct yourselves in a manner or not able to do something because of the nature of the trial and the manner within which it's being conducted, please let us know because we want to accommodate you. We have staff on hand to help you through that and those issues. And so we want you to be able to to do it just as much as we possibly can, as if you were live and in court present, okay? Just got a little note there that perhaps Judge Ofalu would have a comment.
Thank you, Judge Poovey. I just wanted to say, for the benefit of all the lawyers, that I've had my video off all day today, and there's no comment, or shouldn't take anything from that. I've been getting a little yellow triangle telling me that my bandwidth is not adequate for the task. So to avoid interrupting anybody, I've kept my video off, and that even though I kept getting the little yellow triangle, I was able to hear everything. So just wanted to let you know that there was no comment being made about the fact that you couldn't see me today. So thank you to everybody.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. I hope that you have a great weekend, and we will see you back here Monday morning at 9:30. We'll start back Monday morning at 9:30. I did get an email a little while ago from AOC saying that Cisco WebEx was doing some sort of updates this weekend, which I didn't like getting that email, because it seems like every time there's an update, things go wrong. It said that the service would be out tomorrow from like 1 to 2:30 or something. So I hope that when we get back here on Monday, everything is a smooth reopening, but keep your fingers crossed. But in any event, if that's all, then we'll go ahead and adjourn for today, and we will see you all Monday morning at 9:30, okay?
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Your Honor.
We'll recess till 9:30 a.m. Monday.